Hey everyone, my name is Fiona, and in this video I'm going to be doing an analysis of Lutoslawski's Venetian Games. And let me give you just a brief overview of about this piece. So basically, Venetian Games, or Jeux Venetiens in French, refers to both the aleatory game played by Lutoslawski and to the location of its incomplete first performance in Venice. Let me actually share my screen for this. I have a PowerPoint. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so the premiere of this piece, without the third movement, occurred on April 1961 in the Teatro La Fenice by the Krakow Philharmonic Chamber Orchestra, conducted by Andrzej Markowski. And the first complete performance, which included the third movement and a slight revision of the other movements, occurred at the Warsaw Autumn Festival on September 16th, 1961, by the National Philharmonic Orchestra, which was conducted by Witold Rawicki. So the title Venetian Games might suggest a connection to the lively and festive atmosphere of Venetian celebrations, but Lutoslawski's work is more abstract and does not necessarily depict a specific programmatic narrative. So instead, it's actually exploring the interplay between order and chance, structure, and spontaneity. I also kind of noticed from this piece, which was, and this is kind of common with a lot of his pieces, and he actually denies it in a lot of his pieces, but it's almost like the individual versus the society as a whole. Or you can think about the individual person versus the government, or the individual against the collective. There does seem to be kind of a dynamic of that kind of working itself out in a lot of his music, I think, but he doesn't specifically say that. Okay. So Lutoslawski identified this piece as a significant milestone in his compositional journey. So it's kind of the onset of his mature period as a composer, since it showcased his innovative approach to musical structure and the use of controlled aleatoric or chance elements. So Jeux Venetiens relates to Lutoslawski's organization of time, as the 5 songs relates to his organization of pitch. Okay. So his inspiration for this piece, he says that he was inspired by John Cage when he first heard a radio broadcast of the concert for piano and orchestra in 1960. And that inspired him to use chance procedures. He then thanked John Cage by giving him an autographed score of Jeux Venetiens. And it's important to note that Lutoslawski was more stimulated by the ideas of Cage and not so much about the sound of the music itself. So kind of like how I mentioned earlier, the significance of this piece, it's known for its intricate application of a deliberate aleatoric technique. Limited aleatory is introduced, as indicated by the term games in the title. And it also alludes to instances of collective ad libitum, where specific musical elements are entrusted to the discretion of the performers within a predefined guidelines by the composer. So this approach basically fosters a measure of flexibility and unpredictability while kind of keeping this overarching structural framework. And most people think the third movement is kind of this, the magical, most successful movements out of the 4 movements in the piece. But there's kind of this overarching impression, and this was something that I got from Stephen Secchi's book, but that the composer didn't fully master this new technique that he was utilizing in this piece. So the composition kind of falls a little bit short of delivering a fully convincing musical statement. So it was a great experiment, and it was brilliantly conceived, but it's kind of falls a little bit short on delivering its a powerful musical statement. So let's just also clarify chance and aleatory. So we know that chance has been central to Lutoslawski's vocabulary since 1960, and aleatory is defined as depending on the throw of a die or dice. Lutoslawski uses the term in application of the concept in his music as recognizing a framework of limitation within a range of possibilities. So we know when we toss a die, there's one outcome from a set of 6 possibilities. When we toss 2 dice, it results in 21 possible combinations. So in each case, the entire spectrum of potential outcomes is anticipated. And aleatory aspects of chance should not be confused with things that are random. So aleatory is a compositional technique which employs a limited element of chance and is not entirely chaos. Now, talking about the differences from performance to performance with this piece, there are slight differences in the piece between performances, but they're often not very discernible because the aleatory technique does not affect the form as a whole. And individual performers cannot choose which sections they play or the order in which they play them. And there's no indeterminacy or improvisation in the music. So there is some confusion about him bringing in improvisation or that the form can change, but it's actually the players have a very small window from which they can kind of wiggle room that they can kind of play within. So let's talk about the instrumentation of this piece. And I know that I kind of talked in the slide, I have his late works and 4 broad aspects of style. I'm not going to really go into this so much. That could be maybe for another lecture. So let's talk about the instrumentation for this piece. So the work is scored for a chamber orchestra of 29 soloists, including 7 woodwinds, which includes 2 flutes, 1 oboe, 3 clarinets, and 1 bassoon, 3 brass, 4 percussionists, 1 harp, piano, 4 hands, and then you have 12 solo strings. So 4, 3, 3, 2. And we needed that specific set of 12 strings in order to play the 12-note chords. And also, the instrumentation plays a really important role in defining the contrasting elements of the individual movements. So in the first and the second movements, those are based on the contrast between the strings and the other players. And then in movement 3, it's the solo flute that's being supported by the remaining woodwinds, harp, and piano. And then in movement 4, which is the finale, that's only where everything finally comes together on a grand scale. So let's also talk about the ad libitum sections. So they stand side by side with traditional a battuta, or what we call measured time sections. So movement 1 uses both ad libitum and a battuta. Movement 2 uses exclusively a battuta, except for the piano part near the end. Movement 3 uses exclusively a battuta, and movement 4 uses both ad libitum and a battuta. And the form of the whole piece, again, it's 4 movements. It's only 13 minutes in length. You have 3 orchestral miniatures, which are simple in structure, and a finale that is slightly longer. So let's talk about the individual movements, and we'll start with movement 1. And I'm actually going to pull up the score for this because it will be important to see. Okay, so here we go. Here's the score. And it might be hard to see everything. So the first movement, it repeatedly juxtaposes 2 contrasting textures of music. There's like an A and a B type of sections. One of the sections is more lively and extroverted with the woodwinds, and the other texture is more soft and static. I'm going to talk about that more in a little bit. So the piece is divided into 8 sections, as you see. We have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. And this is also the order of the performance. Okay, so each section begins with a percussive hit. Okay, so you have a percussive hit, and it's basically a percussive strike that's played fortissimo by side drums, claves, and xylophone, and it marks the beginning of each section and also abruptly terminates the previous section. The form could be called refrains or ritornelli and episodes. And this is a common procedure for a lot of introductory movements in Lutoslawski's work. Okay, so let's talk about the refrains. So we have the A, C, E, and G sections here. So this consists of woodwind texture of aleatory counterpoint that is rhythmically active and intervallically angular that alternates with the episodes, which are more static and sustained in nature. So you'll notice that the instrumentation is increased with each iteration of the episode, which gives the piece a sense of direction and progression throughout. Okay, and then we're gonna look, so the refrains are based on two superimposed 12-note chords. So let me share that in my PowerPoint. Also, I want to show this is kind of the different alternating sections. So we have the woodwind, the aleatoric section. These are the refrains, and then this is juxtaposed with the B sections, or I should say the string static section. So it's kind of, they just alternate, and you'll notice that the refrains, they add more instrumentation each time. I'm gonna get to that in a second. So here we're kind of talk about the refrains are based on two superimposed 12-note chords. So the first chord is heard each time in sections A, C, E, and G, and it's played in an angular arpeggiated figurations by 7-part woodwind section. And that's the 2 flutes, oboe, 3 clarinets, and bassoon, and contains only interval classes 2, 3, and 5. It's also a vertically symmetrical construction of both major seconds and minor thirds around an axis of a perfect fourth. The second 12-note chord that we see is fully overlaid on the first section in section G and partially in section E. So let's take a look at those sections. So here we go. Okay. Yeah, so in section E, 3 brass instruments play a 4-note semitone cluster. That's the G to the B flat. That fills the axis interval of the first 12-note chord, the perfect fourth, F sharp to B. And then in section G, the piano part basically plays a widely spaced symmetrical pattern of superimposed minor thirds that complement the brass cluster and completes the second 12-note chord. So the whole idea is based on vertical symmetry. And this is something that Lutoslawski said in the Bondman-Ray book. So let's talk about the episodes. So sections B, D, F, and H. Okay. That's these guys. So these are string dominated textures that play sustained, soft, static 8-note semitone clusters. Each begins with one and then gradually transposes to another. In episodes B and D, the transposition is upward, while the last episode transposes the cluster down and dies away as parts gradually stop. The harmony at F has only one 8-note vertically symmetrical extended chord of superimposed minor and major thirds, which results in 2 minor 7th chords placed a minor 9th apart. At the end of episode H, the composer uses dramaturgy and thwarts the listener's expectation with another percussion signal, which suggests another refrain, but this does not happen. Basically, the percussion players strike again 3 times with a reduced number of participants and a dynamic that becomes quieter and quieter, going from fortissimo to forte to mezzo forte to piano, and then the movement ends with a solitary side drum. So I also want to share that I made a little bit of a chart for this. So again, this is just kind of showing the duration in seconds. So it's like building up until we get the codetta. But here in this chart that I made, you can kind of see a little bit more of how the timbre kind of is contrasted with, they're alternating types of texture that are going back and forth from one another. Starting with the A section with the woodwinds, lively and extroverted. The register is widely spaced. The micro rhythm is very active, and there's collective libitum. And then the dynamic is moderately loud. Texture is lively and extroverted. And so it just kind of keeps going back and forth between these. And then you'll see again, the episodes are building up in instrumentation. Okay, so let's move on to movement 2. Here we go, movement 2. This movement only lasts 1.5 minutes. So in the first movement, the refrains are directed ad libitum. Now here in the second movement, it's a very short scherzo in triple meter, but it's weird because it's written in 2/4 time signature. And if we look, the notation kind of obscures the meter and the bar lines are dotted. And the score actually could have been notated conventionally since all of the instruments are subject to being controlled by the meter, except for one short passage in the piano. The content for the second movement is pretty much textural in nature with little that can be described as melodic. There's a lot of fast rhythmic pace that's created by these fragmentary motoric riffs. And the dynamic level is low throughout, mostly pianissimo. Let's take a quick peek. Oh, and we'll get into that. Yeah, so we're gonna look at the score really fast. So second movement. Yeah, you'll see these like motoric riffs that kind of happen throughout. It creates this kind of fast pace, and the dynamic level is low throughout, but it does elevate to mezzo forte in the bassoon and first clarinets part when they develop slightly more expansive phrases. So the structure is basically based on the alternation of two contrasting styles of texture. So there's an A and there's a B with two variations added. So we might call this like A, B, A prime, B prime, A double prime, B double prime. And the material to A is basically the strings, and it's basically diminutive fragments arranged antiphonally between two contrapuntal voices, interspersed with brief periods of silence. And then each voice is actually a group of 3 or 4 individual string parts. And as the section unfolds, 4 to 5 little phrases become apparent, and their limits are defined by the vertical width of each fragment that's stated by the voice groups, which range from 1 to 6 semitones. And I have a graph that shows that. So here we can kind of see the width. This is the schematic reduction of the opening of the second movement of Jeux Venetiens. So the vertical width of each voice bundle. Okay, and ranging again from 1 to 6 semitones. These are the numbers are the semitones. So, okay, let's move to movement 3. Movement 3 is supposedly the most successful and the most memorable out of all the movements. So here we go to movement 3. So this has movement 3 actually has a piano that's playing a continually unfolding 12-note row containing only perfect fourths and perfect fifths as adjacent intervals delivered in full 13 times. So you'll see the piano right here playing a 12-note row. And the first section of the piece, the prime form of the row is G, C, F, B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat, G flat, B, E, A, D. Appears full and 8 times, plus the first note at letter L of what would be the 9th statement. And then the central section L to Q does not use the row. And then after Q, the inversion of the row is delivered 5 times, plus the first 2 notes of what would be the 14th statement. So in this movement, the piano is just one of several strands of independent parts of the whole texture. And it does provide a harmonic color against which the soft flute plays out a melodic line. And if we go back to the beginning of this section, the flute is actually playing a tight 3-note cell of whole steps to half steps, which widens to a larger interval span. The other woodwinds sustain notes as a lingering harmonic echo of prominent notes in the flute melody. The harp is also a supportive instrument, but with clustered motifs that gradually become more active and expansive. The strings do not accompany the flute, but punctuate the movement with 16 chords, mostly of 12 notes. And they become successfully louder up to Q and then gradually quieter until the end. So there's a succession of dynamic levels assigned to these chords, which shows that this movement is basically planning this this climactic moment towards Q. I kind of mark the climax kind of M to Q here before it mellows out. And so both the flute melody and its supporting layers, including the piano roll, begin with smaller interval patterns all situated in the middle of the register. And by octave displacements in the piano part, introduction of different interval patterns in the flute solo, they move towards the climax of the movement between M and Q. Then from Q, the intervals of the flute melody contract until they return to the original 3-note cells, but this time in the highest register. Okay, so before we go into the fourth movement, we have a formal kind of scheme that's happening here. And these are just these are the different, the widths of the notes that are being used in the third movement. So here we're kind of looking at how each movement kind of fits into a whole. The first movement is fragmented and inconclusive. The second movement is fast moving and fearless. The third is carrying the main melodic focus. And the final movement completes the scheme by building to a decisive climax and then mellowing out. So this is basically a 4-movement design that provides a perfect illustration of the formal principles that Lutoslawski recalled from his studies with Malazewski's 4 characters that correlate to the 4 movements. We have the introductory, the transitional, the narrative, and the concluding. So the flute solo is the only narrative element of the entire work, and the other movements are defined by their function in relationship to the scheme as a whole. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, we're going to talk about the final movement, and let's go back to the score. So the fourth movement is the final movement. It's the most affected by aleatory principles. So as the movement unfolds, contrasted instrumental blocks are overlapped and superimposed. So although the aleatory counterpoint within each textural block is controlled, there is a scope of discrepancy in the coordination of these blocks, right? So you have this type of static 12-note chord in the strings, and then you have this mobile sound image of complex microrhythms in the woodwinds, and they kind of come in where they're kind of overlapping. So yeah, the effect of this is a dense sound mass. This is a way more radical chance procedure than the straightforward sectional construction of the first movement, where you just have the different sections that are alternating with one another. So again, we have the static 12-note chord in the strings and this mobile sound image. And this is in the woodwinds. And basically, the microrhythmic complexity is created by introducing polyrhythm. So while the beat is 1 second of time, the individual parts have duple, triple, and quintuple subdivisions of this beat. So in this way, the effect of collective ad libitum occurs through metrical playing, which allows precise control of both rhythm and harmony. And then contrast between the static and mobile textures is not only rhythmic, but also harmonic. Each statement of the static part gives a 12-note chord in tritones at perfect fifths, and then each statement of the mobile sound image is a composed out 12 chord in semitones. So as this introduction ends of this fourth movement, the mobile texture, which is now transferred to the strings, is gradually taken over by sforzando accents. Okay, and this is basically to announce the main part of the movement has begun. And then a piano right here basically interrupts the introductory passage to announce the main part of the pieces here. And then a succession of vividly differentiated textural themes are now delivered in 4 orchestral groups. And this is important. They have 4 different, you have the woodwinds, the brass, the piano forehands, and the strings overlapping each other more closely in accelerating polyphonic textures, and each texture is played in collective ad libitum. And the conductor indicates only the entrances of the various blocks or various groups. And so this overlapping texture is called multi-layeredness and polychronic tendency, which is a technique motivated by the realization that limited aleatorism tends to create static textures. There's the conflict between the layers as well as the quickening pace at which new ones are being added, which produces a musical tension or a sonic brawl among the four groups of instruments. And there's 3 stages in the macro rhythmic accelerando. Stage 1, which starts on page 33. So right here, the macro rhythm, the interval becomes successive entries. Oh, an interval between successive entries contracts from 5 to 3 seconds. Okay, so we see it's 5 seconds, and then it goes to 4 seconds, 4 seconds, 4 seconds, and then we have 3 seconds. Stage 2 is when it goes from 3 seconds to 1 second. So here we're 3 seconds, 3 seconds, 3 seconds, and then it goes to 1 second. And then stage 3, which is page 40, here it goes from 1 second to less than half a second. So towards the end of this process, it's important to reintroduce the meter in order to control the rapid succession of entrances. This macro rhythm has been transformed into micro rhythm, but it's no longer to really hear by ear the textural themes as they're entering, because everything just becomes a giant sound mass. So in this movement, the superimpositions of the blocks are obscured to create a dense buildup, and there's a climax at G, where 2 explosive outbursts of ad libitum playing in the winds and strings basically set stage for the piano to play violent clusters which span the entire range of the keyboard. The percussion then enter alone to a fortissimo mode to continue to the climax, playing a 3-part rhythmic canon in augmentation. And this is kind of an interesting thing. This is him using dramaturgy, because it's like he wants the percussion's trying to, reach the same level, the same dynamic level of the climax, but it's no use because the celeste, harp, and piano enter soon afterwards, softly arpeggiating 12-note chords, and in the end, the percussion gives up and quiet prevails. So it's kind of like, it's like the percussion tries, but then it wins out by the soft quietness. And then a subdued epilogue follows, in which the 4 orchestral groups, the woodwinds, the celeste, harp, and lower strings, brass and vibraphone, and piano, and upper strings and harmonics play echoes of the kinds of textures that kind of created this catastrophe. And if we notice this, the climax in this 4th movement occurs much later in the work. It actually occurs at 8/10 of the duration of the piece. So, anyways, yeah, this is a pretty profound piece, and I definitely think you should listen to it and check it out. It definitely has some very interesting technique, and especially with the chants and the aleatory and the ad libitum sections, and just with what he did with form, I think is very powerful. Let me just go to my last slide here on my PowerPoint. This just kind of shows the kind of the entire movement in seconds. So we have this introduction, the abatuta part, the polyphonic textures, the climax, subsidence, and then the epilogue. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the piece. And me personally, I was very intrigued by this because I know there's no improvisation in this piece, but there is wiggle room for performers to kind of add a little bit of their own essence, their own personality into the music, and I think that's important. I think that there's music where the composer has full reign over everything, and they control every single aspect that the performer does. And in this case, the composer does have pretty much all control, but there is some wiggle room, and I kind of like that. So yeah, Venetian Games by Lutoslawski. Thanks for listening.